It was a warm spring afternoon when Lila Thornwood, the young and somewhat spoiled stepdaughter of the billionaire, Gregory Thornwood, found herself standing in the middle of the sprawling estate's garden. The vibrant flowers, meticulously arranged by the family's longtime gardener, were meant to be a testament to the wealth and opulence of the Thornwood family. It was a paradise, until it wasn't. Lila, a striking figure with long, glossy black hair and an air of entitlement, stormed through the rows of perfectly aligned flowers, her expression one of outrage. She could hardly believe her eyes. The once pristine garden now looked as though a tornado had ripped through it. The petals of her beloved roses scattered across the damp earth. The delicate vines she had nurtured for months were trampled, and the perfectly manicured hedges had been torn down in some reckless, chaotic manner. How could this happen? She muttered to herself, frustration bubbling up inside her. This garden had been her pride and joy, a reflection of her tastes, and a piece of her identity within the grand estate. It was supposed to be perfect, and yet, here it was, ruined. Her sharp eyes scanned the area, landing on a figure in the distance. A young man, crouched near the farthest corner of the garden, pulling weeds. His back was turned, but Lila recognized him immediately. Ethan Parker, the gardener's son. She had never liked him much, though she couldn't exactly pinpoint why. There was something about his quiet demeanor and the way he seemed to disappear into the background that unsettled her. But it was his presence here, in the middle of her garden, that now filled her with righteous indignation. She marched over, her heels clicking against the stone pathway, each step echoing in the stillness of the garden. When she reached him, she didn't bother to greet him. Instead, her voice cut through the air, sharp and accusatory. "What have you done?" she demanded, her eyes flashing with fury. "Look at my garden. This was all your fault, wasn't it?" Ethan, startled by her outburst, stood up slowly, brushing his hands off as he faced her. His expression was neutral, as it always was, but there was a hint of discomfort in his eyes. He had grown used to Lila's harsh words over the years, but he had never quite learned how to deal with them. "I'm sorry, Miss Thornwood," he said quietly, his voice calm but carrying a weight of responsibility. "I didn't mean for anything to get damaged. The wind was very strong today. It might have been what caused the flowers to fall, but I assure you, I didn't ruin anything intentionally." Lila's eyes narrowed. She didn't want excuses, she wanted results. She couldn't stand the thought of anything being out of her control, especially her precious garden. "This isn't just the wind," she said, her voice rising slightly in volume. "You were supposed to be looking after it. My father pays your family handsomely to maintain this place, and this is how you repay him, by ruining everything I care about." Ethan opened his mouth to reply, but before he could get a word out, Lila's sharp tone interrupted him again. "Don't speak to me like I don't know what's going on. I've seen the way you look at the garden, like it's just a chore for you. You don't care about it. You don't care about anything but yourself." Her words stung, but Ethan held his ground. He was used to being judged for things outside of his control. Being the son of the gardener had always come with its own set of challenges, not the least of which was the expectations placed on him by people like Lila. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Ethan replied, his voice low and steady. "But I'm just doing my job. If something went wrong, I'll do my best to fix it." Lila took a step closer, the space between them narrowing. She could feel the heat of her anger burning hotter now, and she wasn't sure if it was from the damage to her garden or from the years of frustration that had built up with the boy who seemed to always be around, never speaking out, just working quietly in the background. It irritated her more than she cared to admit. "I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation," she said, her eyes cold. "This garden isn't just a garden. It's my sanctuary, my escape from everything, and you've destroyed it. I can't just let that slide." Ethan opened his mouth again, his face now tinged with a mix of hurt and frustration. But before he could speak, a new voice cut through the tension. "Lila, what's all this commotion about?" It was Gregory Thornwood, Lila's father, walking toward them with his usual confident stride. His appearance, always impeccable in his tailored suits, immediately commanded attention. He had the presence of a man who had built an empire, and it was hard not to be aware of his power. Lila turned to face him, her expression shifting in an instant from one of anger to one of almost childlike dependence. "Father, you need to do something." "Ethan ruined my garden. I don't know what happened, but this is unacceptable. I want him to fix it, or better yet, I want him gone." Gregory's eyes moved from his daughter to Ethan, sizing up the situation. He wasn't surprised by his daughter's reaction. Lila had always been a perfectionist, and any deviation from her expectations was met with hostility. However, something about this scene seemed different. The damage to the garden was significant, but it didn't look like it was Ethan's doing, or at least not entirely. "Lila," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Let's take a moment before we jump to conclusions." He turned his gaze to Ethan, who stood silently, his hands clasped in front of him. "Ethan, what happened?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking, his eyes flicking nervously between Lila and Gregory. He knew that his words might not be enough to quell the storm that was brewing, but he had to try. "The wind was strong today," he said, keeping his voice steady. "And some of the flowers, they were knocked over. I've been trying to clean up, but the damage was done before I could do anything about it." Gregory nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't quick to judge, especially when it came to the staff. He had learned over the years that things were not always as they seemed at first glance. "I see," Gregory said, turning to his daughter. "Lila, perhaps you should take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Ethan is only doing his job, and it's not his fault that nature had other plans today." Lila's mouth opened in protest, but before she could voice her anger, her father raised a hand to silence her. "We're going to have to work together to fix this," Gregory continued, his tone now more serious. "This garden isn't just about flowers, it's about what we do when things go wrong. I suggest you both take some time to think about it. We'll figure out how to restore the garden, but not by blaming others." Lila stood there, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't like what her father was saying, but she knew better than to argue with him when he spoke like that. He had a way of cutting through the noise, making her realize that not everything could be controlled. As the sound of footsteps retreated into the background, Lila was left standing in the garden, her thoughts swirling like the petals that had fallen. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, this confrontation, would be the beginning of something much bigger than a ruined garden. And little did she know, it would be the first step toward the truth about her family and her own future. The evening sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a soft orange glow across the garden as Lila stood motionless, staring at the disarray before her. Her father's words echoed in her mind, but the frustration she felt was still palpable, like a stone lodged deep in her chest. The garden was her domain, a reflection of herself, and seeing it in chaos felt like a personal betrayal. But Gregory's insistence that she take a step back lingered in her thoughts, challenging her to rethink the entire situation. Ethan, too, was processing the events. He had spent the last few hours cleaning up the mess as best as he could, though the damage was still evident. His hands were scratched, his clothes smeared with dirt, but he didn't mind the work. What bothered him was the way Lila had spoken to him, her words sharp, accusing him without giving him a chance to explain. As he worked, his mind wandered back to the Thornwood estate and how things had always been. His father, the gardener, had served the Thornwoods for decades, and Ethan had spent most of his childhood in these gardens. Despite his humble beginnings, he had always taken pride in his work, but Lila, she had always looked at him with a sense of disdain, like he was part of the background noise that existed only to serve her needs. And now, standing amidst the wreckage of the garden, he felt that same sting of judgment. But he wasn't about to back down. Not this time. Hours later, when the sun had set and the estate was draped in the quiet of the evening, Lila sat on the terrace of the grand mansion. Her thoughts swirled, unable to settle. Her father had insisted on a meeting the following morning, and she wasn't sure what he was going to say. In truth, she wasn't even sure what she wanted him to say. Her pride demanded that she be vindicated, but the more she thought about it, the less certain she was that Ethan was truly to blame. Was it just the wind as he had said, or was there more at play? She glanced down at her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Part of her wanted to reach out to one of her friends, vent about the situation, but she quickly stopped herself. They wouldn't understand. No one ever understood the weight of being Gregory Thornwood's daughter. The expectations were suffocating, and every flaw, every mistake felt like an irrevocable failure. Even a garden, a simple garden, could become a battleground in the world she had been thrust into. Just as she was about to slip the phone back into her pocket, a soft knock sounded at the door. "Miss Thornwood, your father requests your presence in the study." It was the butler, who spoke in his usual monotone, a voice Lila had grown used to over the years. She nodded in acknowledgement and stood, smoothing her dress. The weight of the situation hung heavy in her chest as she made her way through the grand hallways, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors. When she reached the study, Gregory was sitting behind his massive oak desk, the same desk where he had likely signed millions of dollars worth of contracts and made life-altering decisions. His back was to her, but he turned as she entered, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers with that calm, assessing gaze she had grown accustomed to over the years. "Sit, Lila," he said, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk." Leela obeyed, taking a seat in the chair across from him. She kept her posture straight, her arms folded across her chest. There was a quiet tension in the room, one that lingered like a heavy fog. She knew this conversation would be important, but she wasn't sure what direction it would take. "I've been thinking," Gregory began, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk, "about today's incident in the garden." Lila said nothing, her gaze fixed on him. She wasn't sure what he expected from her, but she didn't intend to speak first. If he wanted to scold her, he could do so. She wasn't afraid of him, not really. But his presence was commanding, and in that moment she wasn't entirely certain what would happen next. "I know you're upset," Gregory continued, "and I understand why, but I also think there's something you're not seeing, something you may not want to see." Lila's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? Ethan ruined my garden. It's as simple as that." Gregory's eyes softened for a moment, but his expression remained serious. "It's not that simple, Lila. You're too quick to place blame on others without considering the full picture." Lila's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean? He was the one who was supposed to be taking care of it. If it wasn't him, then who?" Gregory leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together on the desk. "You know as well as I do that Ethan has worked here for years. He's never once made a mistake of this magnitude. You're right in saying the garden was damaged, but I think it's important to ask yourself why it happened, and more importantly, who it affects." Lila opened her mouth to retort, but Gregory raised his hand to stop her. "I'm not saying that Ethan is without fault, but I am saying that you need to think beyond the surface. The damage to the garden, the wind, it's all part of a larger picture, and in the grand scheme of things, this garden is just that, a garden. There are more important things in life than plants, Lila." Her father's words hit her harder than she expected. She wanted to argue, to defend her position, but a small part of her knew he was right. She had placed too much of her self-worth in that garden, too much of her identity in its perfection. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to reassess what truly mattered. Gregory stood, walking over to the window. The vast estate stretched before him, the garden still visible in the distance, though the chaos was less pronounced in the fading light. "You're a thornwood," he said, turning back to face her. "And thornwoods don't crumble under pressure. They adapt, they grow." Lila felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "And what does that have to do with Ethan?" Gregory smiled faintly, as though he had been waiting for this question. "Everything. The real lesson here isn't about blaming people. It's about understanding how we deal with setbacks. You can't always control the wind, Lila. Sometimes you have to let go." Lila sat back, absorbing his words, but a sense of unease still lingered. There was more to this than just a ruined garden, more to the tension between her and Ethan, and though she didn't realize it yet, more to the story than either of them could understand at that moment. As she left the study, her mind was still reeling, but one thing was certain, she wasn't the same person who had stormed into that garden hours ago. Things were about to change, and whether she liked it or not, the winds of change had already begun to blow. The days following that tense conversation in the study were a blur for Lila. She had gone through the motions of her daily life, attending to her usual routines, but her mind kept returning to the garden. Gregory's words about adapting and growing lingered, and though she hated to admit it, part of her began to feel the weight of her obsession with perfection. She had always been told that she was the epitome of success, that everything she touched turned to gold, but now, for the first time, Lila began questioning if that had been the right approach. Was this really who she wanted to be? Someone who cared more about appearances than substance? The following afternoon, as she wandered the estate, her gaze inevitably fell on the garden once more. The flowers Ethan had salvaged were beginning to show signs of life again, despite the damage. Some of the roses, once broken and bent, had straightened out in the sunlight, while the damaged hedges had been trimmed down to their stumps, awaiting the careful hands of a gardener to restore them. Her thoughts, heavy with conflict, were interrupted by a familiar voice calling from behind. "Miss Thornwood, I was hoping to speak with you." Lila turned to see Ethan approaching. He was dressed in his usual work clothes, his sleeves rolled up as he held a trowel in one hand. His posture was humble, but there was something in the way he stood that made Lila's heart race, a strange mix of defensiveness and determination. "What is it, Ethan?" she asked, her tone flat. She had no desire to engage with him, not after the confrontation, but there was something about his presence that piqued her curiosity. I wanted to apologize for the way things went yesterday," Ethan said, his voice steady, though there was a slight edge of discomfort. "I didn't mean for the garden to get ruined, and I certainly didn't mean to upset you." I've worked here long enough to know how much it means to you. I should have been more careful, and I'm sorry that I didn't meet your expectations. Lila felt a flicker of surprise. Ethan wasn't someone who typically apologized. He had always been the silent type, a boy who did his job and kept to himself. But here he was, offering an apology that in some ways felt more genuine than the numerous ones she'd received from people in her life who were far more experienced in the art of placating her. She stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to lash out, to remind him of the damage he had caused, to demand more than just words. But another part of her, the part that her father's lessons had begun to awaken, was starting to reconsider her actions. "You're right," she said after a long pause, her voice quieter than before. "I overreacted. I'm sorry for accusing you. This garden means a lot to me, and I let my emotions take over. That wasn't fair to you." Ethan gave her a small nod, his expression softening. "I understand. I'll do my best to fix everything, Miss Thornwood. It's the least I can do after the mess I made." Lila felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. For the first time in days, the tension that had built up inside her seemed to dissipate. It wasn't perfect. She still had a long way to go in accepting that she couldn't control everything, but it felt like a step forward. Maybe it was possible to let go of the need for everything to be flawless, for everything to be within her grip. As Ethan turned to leave, Lila's gaze followed him for a moment. Something about him intrigued her, his quiet confidence, his steady approach to life, even in the face of her accusations. He was different from the others in her life, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she wanted to learn more about him, but she pushed that thought aside. After all, he was just the gardener's son, wasn't he? The following weeks brought a sense of calm to the estate, though the damage to the garden was still a lingering reminder of the tension between Lila and Ethan. Yet, as the garden slowly began to recover, so did Lila's relationship with Ethan. She found herself begrudgingly at first seeking his opinion on things, on flowers, on the best way to restore the hedges, on the weather patterns that might affect the blooms. Each time their paths crossed, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They didn't need to discuss what had happened. They both knew it had been a moment of frustration, a moment of overreaction. What mattered was the quiet repair that was happening, not just to the garden, but to their relationship. One day, as Lila stood by the garden's edge, observing the progress, Ethan approached her again, this time holding a small potted plant in his hands. "I thought you might like this," he said, offering her the plant. "It's a rare orchid. I've been growing it for a while now. Thought it might add something special to your garden." Lila took the plant, her fingers brushing against his as she did. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, something shifted inside her. She had expected to be the one giving, the one in control, but here Ethan was, offering something without expecting anything in return. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than before. She glanced at the orchid, then back at Ethan. "I didn't expect this." Ethan smiled slightly. "It's nothing. Just thought it'd be a good fit." Lila paused for a moment, then, almost as if on impulse, she spoke again. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what my father said. About growing, adapting, and I think I might have misunderstood a lot of things." Ethan tilted his head, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of curiosity. How so?" "I used to think everything had to be perfect," Lila confessed, her voice hesitant. "I thought that if I could control everything, especially things like this garden, then maybe I'd finally feel like I was in control of my life. But the truth is, I've been missing the point. It's not about perfection. It's about letting things grow naturally, even when they get a little messy, even when things go wrong." Ethan nodded slowly, as if he understood. "I think that's the real beauty of it. Gardens don't grow in straight lines, and neither do people. Sometimes you have to embrace the mess to see the full picture." Lila smiled, the first genuine smile in a long while. "I think you're right." And in that moment, she realized something else. Something even more profound. She wasn't just learning how to let go of control in her garden. She was learning how to let go of it in her life, in her relationships, and in her own identity. It wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time in a long time, Lila felt like she was on the right path. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone on it after all. Lila's heart pounded in her chest as her father's car came to a slow halt at the entrance of the estate. The heavy crunch of gravel beneath the tires seemed amplified in the stillness of the garden. The air between her and Ethan had thickened with unsaid words, and though she could feel his gaze lingering on her, Lila couldn't bring herself to look at him. The weight of what was coming, the conversation she had been dreading, was too much to bear. The sound of the car door opening and closing followed, signaling Gregory Thornwood's arrival. Lila straightened her posture, trying to steady her breath. She could feel her hands trembling slightly, the knots in her stomach tightening with each passing second. Ethan, sensing the change in the atmosphere, gave her a small, supportive nod before turning to walk toward the garden's edge. His departure was quiet, leaving Lila to face her father alone. The presence of her father had always been larger than life, like a towering figure that loomed over her every decision. But today, for some reason, that feeling was more pronounced than ever. It was almost as if Gregory had become more than just her father. He was now the gatekeeper of her future. Lila didn't turn to meet him immediately. Instead, she took a moment to collect herself. When she finally did, her eyes met Gregory's as he stepped into the garden, his sharp suit cutting through the calm of the space like a well-pruned branch. "Lila," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I see the garden is looking better." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yes, it's getting there. Ethan's been helping." Gregory raised an eyebrow, his gaze flickering briefly to the area where Ethan had been working. His tone was neutral, but Lila could tell there was an edge to it, an undercurrent of something unspoken, something he had yet to reveal. "Ethan, I wasn't aware that he had taken such an interest in your garden." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She knew her father well enough to recognize the subtle challenge in his words. Gregory always operated under the assumption that things, people especially, should fall in line with his vision. Ethan, in his mind, was simply the gardener's son, someone who existed in the background, performing his duties without question. The idea that he could have influenced Lila, or that he was in any way significant, was something Gregory would never have expected. "He's been more involved lately," Lila said, her voice wavering just slightly. "I've been learning a lot from him. About gardening, about patience, about letting things grow." Gregory tilted his head, regarding her with a bemused expression. "Learning from the gardener's son?" he repeated, as if the very thought amused him. "Lila, I understand the desire for novelty, but I don't think this is the sort of thing you need to waste your time on." Her frustration flared again, though this time it wasn't directed at Ethan. It was at her father's dismissive tone, his inability to see beyond his narrow world view. "It's not just about the garden, Father. It's about something more." Gregory's eyes narrowed slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line. "More? What do you mean by more?" Lila hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. This wasn't just about a garden or even about Ethan anymore. This was about her identity, her choices, and the future that had always been mapped out for her by her father's expectations. She had spent so long trying to live up to them, trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect heir. But now, with every passing day, she was beginning to question whether that path was truly what she wanted. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she began slowly, her voice quiet but steady. "About the life you've planned for me, about the business, the legacy, everything. And I don't think it's what I want anymore." For a moment, Gregory was silent, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. He said nothing, and the silence stretched on thick and heavy. Lila didn't dare break it. The words she had just spoken hung in the air like a challenge, and she could feel the weight of them settling over her like a heavy cloak. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Gregory spoke. "Lila, you don't know what you're saying. You've been groomed for this. You've been prepared for this responsibility since you were a child." "I know," Lila replied, her voice firmer now. "But I can't live my life just because it's what's expected of me. I need to find my own way. I need to figure out who I really am, not just the person you've shaped me to be." Gregory's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, Lila saw something flicker in his eyes. Something like fear, or maybe it was disbelief. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the stern, controlled expression that was so familiar to her. "You don't understand, Lila," Gregory said, his voice softer but still edged with authority. "The business, the legacy, it's not just about wealth. It's about power. It's about influence. And you, as my daughter, have a responsibility to carry that forward. You can't just walk away from that." "I'm not walking away, Father," Lila replied, her tone now resolute. "But I need to make my own decisions. I want to learn, to grow in a way that makes sense for me, not just because it's what you want." Gregory's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment they stood in silence, the weight of their exchange settling between them. Then, in a voice that was almost a whisper, he said, "You'll regret this, Lila. You'll see, you can't just throw everything away." But Lila stood firm. She wasn't throwing everything away. She was simply choosing to carve her own path, to find a life that was hers, not one that had been dictated to her by the expectations of others. I won't regret it, she said softly but with conviction. I've spent too long being what everyone else expects me to be. I have to see who I really am. For a long moment, her father said nothing. Then he turned away, his footsteps echoing on the gravel path as he walked back toward the mansion. Lila watched him go, her heart still racing in her chest, but this time she felt a sense of relief, a strange quiet peace that had eluded her for so long. As her father's figure disappeared into the distance, Lila turned back toward the garden, her gaze falling on the plants that were slowly starting to recover. She could see the progress, the tiny but significant changes, and she couldn't help but smile. The garden, much like her, was learning to grow in its own way. And as Lila stood there, she realized something else. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She didn't have all the answers, but she was finally ready to find them on her own terms. Lila stood in the garden long after her father had retreated back into the mansion, the weight of their conversation still pressing heavily on her chest. Despite the tension that had lingered between them, there was a strange sense of freedom in the air. She had spoken her truth. For the first time in years, she had voiced what was on her mind without worrying about the consequences. And though Gregory had tried to suppress it, Lila felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. As she walked further into the garden, her thoughts turned to Ethan. He had become an unexpected anchor for her in the midst of all the chaos. The quiet gardener's son whose simple wisdom about nature had begun to challenge the way she viewed everything. She found herself thinking more and more about the way he had approached the garden, patiently, methodically, allowing the plants to grow at their own pace rather than forcing them to fit into a perfect preordained image. It wasn't just the garden that had been growing, it was her too. Her mind wandered back to the brief conversation she had had with Ethan earlier. His quiet support, the way he listened without judgment, had given her the space to open up in ways she hadn't expected. It was as if he understood more about what she was feeling than anyone else. And for once, Lila found herself wanting to talk to him again, to share more than just small pleasantries about flowers or the weather. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft crunch of footsteps approaching. She turned, startled to see Ethan walking toward her from the edge of the garden, a small watering can in his hands. "I thought you might be out here," he said with a slight smile, his voice calm and easy. He was still dressed in his work clothes, but his presence, as always, felt like an oasis of tranquility in the midst of the storm that had been her life recently. Lila gave him a small, tentative smile in return. "I've been thinking," she admitted, her voice quieter than usual, "about what my father said, and about everything else." Ethan nodded, moving to stand beside her as he began watering the rows of roses that had started to bloom again. "It's a lot to process," he said, his tone gentle. "But you don't have to have all the answers right away. It's okay to take your time." Lila watched him as he worked, his hands moving with an ease and grace that seemed to match the calm in his demeanor. He was a person who didn't rush, who didn't feel the need to force things. It was a stark contrast to everything she had known in her life, everything her father had taught her about success, about achievement. And yet, in Ethan's quietness, Lila felt an unspoken wisdom. "I don't know if I can keep living up to what my father expects," she confessed, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to go against it." "You don't have to do it alone," Ethan said simply, his gaze shifting to her as he spoke. "And you don't have to do it all at once. You just have to start somewhere." Lila felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent so many years trying to meet expectations, trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect heir. But in this moment, with Ethan standing beside her, she felt like she had permission to take the first step towards something that was entirely her own. It was liberating and terrifying, all at once. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she had to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. It wasn't just about the garden, or about her father's empire. It was about her, about what she wanted, about who she wanted to become. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what to do next, but I think I need to start with something small, like this garden. I've been so focused on making it perfect that I didn't even stop to think about why it mattered to me in the first place." Ethan smiled, his eyes lighting up as he looked at her. "The garden's never about perfection," he said. "It's about growth. It's about letting things take their own course, even when it feels like they're not where you want them to be." Lila nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. For the first time in years, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something new, something exciting. It wasn't going to be easy, nothing worth doing ever was. But she was ready to start, ready to stop trying to force herself into a mold that didn't fit. She had spent so much time living for others that she had forgotten what it felt like to live for herself. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden, Lila realized something else. She wasn't just learning how to let go of control in the garden, she was learning how to let go of control in her life. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out, seeing a message from her father. "Lila, we need to talk tomorrow. You've made your position clear, but I think it's time to have a real discussion about your future." She read the message several times, each word feeling like a challenge. Gregory Thornwood was not one to back down from a fight, and she knew that their conversation the next day would be no less intense than the one they'd had in the garden. But for the first time, Lila didn't feel afraid. She felt prepared. She had made her choice, and she wasn't going to let anyone dictate her future. Lila put the phone back in her pocket and turned to Ethan, who was still working silently in the garden. "Tomorrow I'm going to face my father," she said with a quiet determination, "and I'm going to tell him that I'm ready to carve my own path." Ethan stopped what he was doing, looking at her with a mixture of pride and understanding. "I know you will, and whatever happens, you'll be okay. You don't need anyone's approval to live the life you want." Lila smiled at him, a genuine smile that felt like the first real one in years. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." As she watched him continue to work, Lila felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to walk it. She had taken the first step toward finding herself, and whatever came next, whether it was her father's wrath or the unknown future, she would face it head on. The garden, much like her life, had been transformed by patience and care, and now, so would she. The night passed uneasily for Lila. Though she had made her decision to confront her father, the weight of it all lingered in her mind. She knew that Gregory Thornwood was not a man who was easily swayed, and the conversation that awaited her in the morning could change everything. Would he truly understand her desire to carve her own path, or would he see it as a betrayal of everything he had built? The morning sun broke through her window, casting long beams of light across her room. Lila sat up in bed, rubbing her eyes. Her mind felt cloudy, but her resolve had not wavered. Today she would take a stand. She would speak her truth, no matter the consequences. As she prepared herself, there was an unexpected calmness in her actions. She dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit, a deep navy blouse and black trousers, far removed from the extravagant attire her father would have expected for such an occasion. She wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore, especially not him. Her thoughts drifted back to Ethan and the conversations they had shared in the garden. His quiet strength had been a reminder to her that it was okay to be imperfect, to embrace the natural flow of life rather than trying to control it all. Ethan hadn't been pushing for anything. He had simply been there, letting things unfold in their own time. That was something she could learn from. Lila left her room and walked through the grand hallway toward her father's study, each step echoing in the silence of the mansion. She had always known that Gregory's study was a place of power, where decisions were made and futures were shaped. It was here, in this very room, that her future had been mapped out for her long ago. When she arrived at the study door, she paused, taking a deep breath. There was no turning back now. She knocked once, then entered without waiting for a response. Gregory was standing by the window, looking out over the estate, his back to her. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the unspoken words between them. "Lila," Gregory said, his tone steady without turning around. "I knew you would come." "I don't have much choice, do I?" Lila replied, her voice firmer than she felt. "You've always made sure I knew exactly what my role was in this family, but now I'm starting to see that maybe it's not the role I want." Gregory turned to face her then, his expression unreadable. "What are you saying, Lila?" Lila took a step forward, the words she had been rehearsing in her mind finally spilling out. "I'm saying that I want to choose my own path. I don't want to just be a placeholder in your empire. I want to find my own purpose, something that matters to me, not just something that you've decided for me." Gregory's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that Lila couldn't quite place. "This is about the garden, isn't it?" Lila shook her head. "It started there, yes, but it's not just about the garden. It's about everything, about me. I've spent my life trying to meet your expectations, to make you proud." But I've never stopped to ask myself what I want, and I can't keep living like that. Gregory's expression hardened slightly. Lila, you don't understand what's at stake here. The business, the legacy, it's all part of something much larger than you or me. It's about preserving the family name, the power, the influence. You're the one who will carry it forward. You're the one who has to continue the work I've built. Lila felt a surge of emotion rise up within her, but she forced it down. I know what you've built, Father. I've watched it all my life, but I've never had a say in it. You've always expected me to step into your shoes without asking what I want for myself, and I can't keep doing that. Gregory stared at her for a long moment, his piercing gaze never leaving her face. For the first time, Lila saw something in him, vulnerability maybe, or perhaps a deep disappointment. You think this is easy? Gregory's voice softened, but it still held an edge. You think it's easy to build something from nothing, to work your entire life for something, only to have it crumble because the next generation doesn't see its value. Lila's heart pounded as she stepped closer, not backing down. I'm not trying to tear everything down, Father. I'm trying to build something that's mine, something that's true to who I am, not just something you expect me to inherit. There was a long silence between them. Lila's breath came quick and shallow, her nerves tingling as she waited for her father's response. Would he lash out? Would he try to convince her once again that she had no choice but to follow in his footsteps? Finally, Gregory spoke, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. I never asked for you to be like me, Lila. I asked for you to take over because I believed in you. I thought you could carry the torch, protect everything we've worked for. Lila swallowed the lump in her throat. But I'm not you, Father. I can't be. I have my own life to live. For a long time, Gregory didn't say anything. He simply stared at her, the weight of his words settling in the room between them. Lila felt the tightness in her chest ease just slightly. She had spoken her truth, and whether or not her father could accept it, she had given him a glimpse of who she was becoming. Finally, Gregory sighed and turned away from her, walking toward the desk. He didn't look back as he spoke. You'll have to face the consequences of this, Lila. I won't sugarcoat it. You're making a choice that's going to change everything, but I suppose I can't stop you from making it. Lila's heart raced. Does that mean you understand? Gregory paused for a moment as if considering her words. Then, without turning back, he replied, I understand that you think you're ready. I hope for your sake that you are. With that, he sat down behind the desk, signaling the end of the conversation. Lila's heart sank. There was no final affirmation, no promise of approval, but somehow she felt a small sense of victory. She had done it. She had taken the first step toward living her own life. As she turned to leave, Lila hesitated, her eyes drifting to the window that overlooked the estate. It was vast, imposing, a symbol of everything her father had built. But now, for the first time, she saw it with new eyes. It wasn't her responsibility to carry this empire alone. She had a choice, and that was the freedom she needed. Walking out of the study, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't sure where her journey would take her, but she was finally on her own path, and in that moment, she knew she would never look back.